Hello watch enthusiasts. Now in this video I'd like to talk about the various designs by the very revered designer Gerald Genta that are very much unknown to the vast majority of people. And of course this revered designer is known for his 1972 release of the Audemars Royal Oak, and indeed the 1976 release of the Patek Philippe Nautilus. But there are a great many other designs for the likes of Omega, Universal Geneve and IWC that are very much unknown among all but collectors. And I think it's very interesting to discuss somewhat some of these watches which follow some really impressive design cues of the designer, and indeed some which really do appear to be very, very different to his usual designs, and that are really forgotten in the mists of time. So I'll start off with a rather interesting release from Universal Geneve in the 1950s. Now the backstory behind the creation of this very iconic Universal Geneve is that in 1948 the overseas Scandinavian airline system was formed as a result of a collaboration between several different firms to handle flights in this area. And they were noteworthy in 1952 for being the first airline to fly over the geographical North Pole in order to shorten flight lengths from Europe to the US. And of course this was in an era with Douglas DC-7s and aircraft of that nature, thus resulting in much longer flight lengths than one would normally see these days, with flights well over the 30-hour mark. So as a result, it was incredibly important, their innovation in terms of navigation, to fly over the North Pole as a shortened route. Therefore, Universal Geneve decided to release what they were going to call the Polar Router, but that ended up being the Pole Router or the Pole Router, depending on where you're from. And this was a watch that was designed to be anti-magnetic, but also simply an attractive timepiece to commemorate this new advance in aviation over the North Pole. And they called upon the 23-year-old Gerald Genta at that time to create this watch for 1954. Now the design of this watch is very, very conservative, but at that era it was definitely a very, very attractive piece, and I think paved the way into the sunburst dials and far more ornate aesthetic of 1950s and 60s timepieces. Of course it had very iconic features such as the twisted lugs seen on modern Omegas in great numbers, and were very, very popular at that time. And indeed, one also has this very, very well recognised chapter ring around the inside of that dial. And the chapter ring features a type of brushing and perlage to give it a contrasting effect to that sunburst centre of the dial, which was seen either in black, silver, or other various brighter colours, but the ones that one can usually get hold of are the black and silvers. And for the first year of production, these watches used the Universal Geneve 138 SS bumper movement, which was used in a great deal of their watches from the late 1940s. But really it was in 1955 when they released this watch with the 215 micro-rotor movement that it really took into its own. At 34.5mm in diameter, it could certainly be seen as a very small watch these days, but for the era it certainly was very well sized, and did feature a case that wasn't deliberately small, it was simply a consequence of the design. And I must say I think these watches have become very, very popular, but due to the fact that they're not as iconic as some of the later designs by Genta, they can be acquired for a very, very good price, around the £500 to £600 mark, which is very, very impressive considering they have a very, very illustrious micro-rotor movement, which was a rarity for the era as it was produced at the same time as some of the other models with micro-rotors, such as the various models from Hamilton. So as a result, this really was an innovative piece in terms of providing new technology, and indeed the birth of really a new designer in the world of watchmaking. Now the Omega Constellation Pie Pan has become a watch which is really very, very well respected in terms of being a timepiece which represents Omega's build quality through the 1950s and 60s. And it's not true to say that Genta designed this watch, because he didn't work at Omega when it was originally designed, but his design is responsible for the most iconic version of it, because it's the last version of the Pie Pan before the recent Globemaster to feature an entirely in-house Omega movement. In later years, they became partially outsourced in terms of movements which were based on other movements from other brands. And as a result, Omega called on Genta to redesign the dials of their watches, and to some extent the cases, in the very late 1950s when they were considering replacing the caliber 550 with the 551 and 561, the 561 being the date version of the 551. And this was a movement which was designed to be one of their very first chronometer movements certified to the full chronometer specification. And as a result, this was a very major move for Omega in terms of producing a new and very groundbreaking timepiece. Omega's main aim of this redesign was to create a far more modern-looking watch, one which took inspiration from previous Pie Pans but created something very, very crisp for indeed this release of their new calibers. And Genta provided this by removing the older, softer indices around the dial, which had various almost floral patterns to them, and replaced them with these very, very sharp and some may seem relatively Spartan indices, which were simple, polished, faceted indices, which have of course become a feature on a great deal of watches these days because of the way they're able to reflect light in a simple sort of way. But he filled them with onyx, so these onyx plates, which were slipped into the centre of these indices, which gave both a luxurious but also a very, very clear black look to the dial, which gave a monochromatic aesthetic which appealed to a great deal of buyers. Of course, the design aesthetic of these watches did remain very, very similar to previous constellations, to stick with the line, so one had that sunburst effect at the centre of the dial, which gave a beautiful lustrous air to this watch and a very, very luxurious aesthetic. And then that very softly brushed area around the edge on those pie pan facets, which again added a real intrigue to the dial and a certain interest for the person reading the watch. Now, similarly to the pie pan versions, many versions of the Constellation with a simple domed dial also saw these redesigns, and have become just as iconic really as this model, though still don't command the same high prices that a pie pan dial from Omega will, due to the rarity of these watches, and the fact that in many people's eyes they're some of the most beautiful dress watches ever made. And sadly, these watches were discontinued in 1969 in favour of a far more 70s aesthetic with tonneau-style cases, and their own design aesthetics, which were very, very different. But indeed, these later watches simply didn't feature the iconic designs that these watches did. Now, the IWC Ingénieur was released in the 1950s originally, in 1954 to be more specific, as a competitor for the Rolex Milgauss, and indeed the Polar Router I showed you earlier in the video, as an anti-magnetic watch for engineers. But it really became popular, or at least very famous, in 1976, when updated by Gerald Genta from the IWC line, as a watch which followed in the footsteps, really, of his 70s designs with integrated bracelets, with those wonderful two-link bracelets as seen in this watch, which were much, much more robust than the bracelets put on, for example, the AP Royal Oak or the Nautilus from Patek Philippe. And as a result spawned a watch which was never as famous as those other two, but in many ways just as noteworthy. Now, this design marked a great departure from previous versions of the Ingénieur, because those watches were polished dress watches, admittedly slightly larger than the usual ones, but on leather straps with a very conventional design, albeit very, very beautiful aesthetics. But Genta took this and created something very, very different, with a style which was typical to him, as I've said, with those bracelets, and indeed a bezel on this watch with those 5 holes which were used to open the watch, very similarly to some of the Seiko Marine Masters, for instance, where one has to remove the bezel and open the watch via the front. Of course, this watch was regarded as very large back then at 40mm in diameter, with that heavy bracelet attached to it, which was very, very solid, as you can see from the photographs. And indeed a bracelet that defined this watch as a far more sporting timepiece than previously seen. The dial was very clean and legible, with a graph paper guilloché dial, which was again very different and typical of IWC, trying to create something very, very innovative and very clearly a sports watch, as a clear difference to other Genta designs. And indeed the watch was generally a very mechanically inspired watch with almost entirely brushed surfaces, except for that polished bevel around the bezel. The main calibre used in this watch was the 8541B from IWC, which was an anti-magnetic calibre with a Faraday cage as well to protect the watch from magnetic fields in its surroundings as an engineer's timepiece. Although it was also available with a non-anti-magnetic movement, which has always puzzled me really, because well, why would you want a watch which is designed really to be an engineer's watch that can't quite perform the job? But then that remains in IWC's history and so on, as a different piece altogether. And a quartz version was also available at the time. Now, this watch was available in 3 versions: a steel version, a two-tone 14-karat gold version, or indeed a full 18-karat gold version. And these watches were only made really in 1,000 examples, so there are only about 1,000 of these watches out there, which means they do command a very high price of around the £10,000 mark. But certainly you are getting a very, very rare timepiece as far as innovations go, and indeed as far as Genta's designs go, taking a turn towards a far more sporting aesthetic. Now, the next watch is the Bulgari, and this is a watch which has become very, very famous as far as being the watch which really made Bulgari as a brand. It's also known as the Bulgari Roma, as was seen on the original 1975 release. And the original 1975 release, which wasn't designed by Gerald Genta, was a digital timepiece designed to combat the Japanese digital watches and quartz watches that were flooding the market and causing really a crisis among luxury timepieces. But it was in 1975 that this watch received its initial design, that was redesigned in 1977 by Gerald Genta, and as a result has really created the aesthetic that has made Bulgari as a brand over the next few years. And this is the watch released in 1977 following Genta's redesign of this watch. And indeed, this is quite an interesting period because it's the post-Royal Oak and Nautilus era, his sort of heyday. So as a result, it was quite interesting to see where Genta went after this. And this Bulgari is designed to look, as was the original, designed to look like a Roman coin. So as a result, the design of the watch features the writing of Bulgari around the outside of that bezel to resemble the aesthetics of a coin, and then with those off-shooting lugs which come out of the circular or cylindrical case, which again adds to the aesthetic of a coin on the wrist. Of course, it has a very flat black dial with again a black and gold aesthetic to be in keeping with that luxurious look that Bulgari were trying to portray here, with very simple straight gold hands and simply 12 and 6 on the dial and the date on the right-hand side, which gave an extremely clean aesthetic to this watch and certainly something that hadn't been seen before. Now, the interesting thing about this watch is that though I think the design of this watch isn't particularly beautiful and is rather dated, though of course that is just my opinion, I do feel that in terms of design it really is a work of brilliance, because this is a watch which was pretty much the first timepiece in the world where the brand name was one and the same as the design of the watch. So this means that people would immediately associate this design with the brand, thus adding a certain degree of importance to the brand as a whole, rather than as simply an attractive design which could be replicated. This was the signature of the brand, which I think is a very, very clever way of marketing a watch, and certainly was, I think, saved the brand during the quartz crisis. Another very telling aspect about this watch is the fact the design has barely changed to this day. And though the modern versions are a little bit more streamlined and also have the seconds placed on the dial in a sub-second register, the general aesthetic and design, especially that bezel, has remained effectively unchanged, which is really a testament to this watch being, though not entirely Genta's design, and I'd certainly concede that, I do feel that his reinterpretation of this style really has helped the brand as a whole. And I can appreciate this even though I don't particularly like the Bulgari. I find it to be a little bit of a cumbersome and clunky design. I think it works extremely well for its purpose, and therefore is certainly worthy of judgment in this video as far as one of his great designs go. Now, the next watch in this list, and indeed the final watch in this list, is the Katya Pasha. And before I talk about the design of this watch, I'd like to talk about the history, because this watch was originally produced in 1932, and this was designed for the Pasha of Marrakesh, who wanted a watch that was formal for dress occasions and could be worn while conducting business, but also could be worn during his daily swim. So as a result, Cartier produced the original Pasha for him, which was a water-resistant timepiece with an interesting crown, with a type of water-resistant crown that at the time was what Cartier could produce to make a watch that was not water-resistant to modern standards, but could take the use in a swimming pool, for instance, that the Pasha needed. And so as a result, this started the story of the Katya Pasha as a timepiece for men in the Cartier lineup. Now, when Cartier wanted to redesign and relaunch this watch in the mid-1980s, they called upon Gerald Genta to produce this new and redesigned reiteration of this watch, with the similar lines to their usual products, but with a very different feel on the wrist, a larger presence. And this is a watch which is quite interesting because to many it has a very effeminate look. But of course this is a watch that was only ever made for men. In more recent years women's versions have been made, but it was originally a man's timepiece. Now, what I find most interesting about this watch is the fact that it has this very elegantly polished case, this wonderful, very traditional dial, and yet it looks very different to other Cartier models. For example, gone are the Roman numerals seen usually. Instead of having those, now these are replaced by Arabic numerals, with that square central section to the dial, which adds to the form of this watch. And of course those lines coming off it show the other indices or numerals around the dial, without having to actually write them or draw them on the dial with any sort of symbol or depiction, which I think cleans the dial up extremely well. Similarly, the crown of this watch is very much in keeping with the fact that this watch has to be a water-resistant timepiece, and of course Cartier have recently released various versions of this watch with dive bezels that are to be used underwater. And of course this seems very alien to a watch that still has a cabochon on the crown, But I think it does this water resistance, and it plays it off in an extremely classical way, with that hinged crown cover, as you can see, with the cabochon on the top, which swings away from the body of the case to reveal the crown for changing the time, which is a very old-fashioned solution to crown waterproofing, and is quite interesting to see here, in keeping with those lines that were so typical of the original, and indeed the purpose the original had to fulfill. This is further echoed through the fact the watch has these Vendôme-style lugs, which are quite typical of a lot of Cartier's models, which are proprietary in terms of fitting straps and bracelets, but do give that typically Cartier format to the watch and a very traditional finish, which I think is very, very attractive and certainly does draw the eye very, very well, in a way that is typical of a watch made by Cartier that is, on the face of it, presented as a sports watch, but in truth really is a piece of great elegance and designed as more of a dress timepiece than anything particularly sporty. And of course, little bits of detailing are quite interesting, because in more recent models, notably the GMT versions, there's a sort of an atlas design on the dial, which adds to I think the historical nature of this watch, because the original Pasha of Marrakesh was known quite commonly in the West as Lord of the Atlas. Anyway, I'll conclude the video here, but please do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of this video, and indeed which era you think was Genta's best. So thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.